Thank you, Amy. That's just really wonderful hearing you girls sing. Excuse me. It's not any virus. It's just a coughing bit you do, So, big welcome to everyone this morning, and a really big special welcome to my Auntie Lily in Brisbane. I'm just so thrilled, Auntie Lily, that you were here watching us every Sunday. You were there when we first live streamed, and you're hanging in there with us. And Beth in Charters Towers. Beth, just wonderful to have you with us this morning. I'm really excited to have a cousin from Charters Towers watching Red Gum Live this morning. And John and Rhonda Grammis, I just think you've got some great family there that's with you this morning, and we just want to say we love you and love you being part of Red Gum with us. Well, today I want to begin a two-part little series, and it's about anxiety. And in uncertain times, anxiety increases. You know that. You know what's going on in our world right now. And what you planned this week may not be possible next week. We had our little 5-year-old granddaughter staying with us, and Coral had to drive back to the New South Wales border yesterday because they're closed, and her dad had to come pick her up, and we had to throw her over this little invisible line, and Dad caught her and took her back, and she's in quarantine for a couple of weeks back there. And our world's changing so quickly, and you know that. Now, Theo tells me that he's not worried about catching COVID. He's not worried about the coronavirus because he's just going to go fishing. Because Theo has remembered that when he goes fishing, he never catches anything. So that's Theo's plan. I'm just going to go fishing and I'm not going to catch anything. But anxiety is real, and it's real in our community, and it's real for some of us in our lives right now. So how does anxiety affect you personally right now? Does God have an answer to the uncertain times we're in and the consequences of living in this change that's going on around us? Well, he does. And I could probably share that answer with you in 5 words. But we're actually going to spend this week and next week laying a foundation so that those 5 words aren't just information, but get in really deep, and they actually will bring change into our lives. So that's where we're going for 2 weeks. We're going to be looking at anxiety, because the answer is not just you doing more, trying harder, trusting God more. The answer isn't even in just something that happens between you and God. It's actually something that involves all of us together. So today we're going to start in the Old Testament, and we're going to look at one story in the Old Testament, and it fills up a whole book. But I could read you that book in one sort of half-hour session, just bang into it. And it's a unique story because the hero is a heroine. And the whole book is based on the story of a woman called Esther. And I'm not quite sure how God managed to squeeze that into the Old Testament in a male-dominated society, but God got it there, and he got the book of Ruth there too. And so we're going to have a look at this unique book today, because in this unusual story, because throughout the whole book, God is not mentioned, not once. Prayer is not mentioned. In fact, the temple and worship and all those things that you would expect in a Bible book are just not there. So we're going to take this book of Story of Esther from 2,500 years ago, and we're going to lay it down as a foundation for where we are right now in 2020. The story begins in a palace complex in an ancient town called Susa. It's now modern Iran. And this nation included 127 provinces that spread from India to Ethiopia. And in this sort of opening scene of the story, King Xerxes, I wish they'd give these people nice names like King Lex or something, like Xerxes. Where do you get off with names like that? But anyway, that was his name. And he's brought all these people, all the sort of power people from around these provinces, all these from this known world, and they're feasting and drinking and partying and banqueting for 7 days. And on that 7th day of this banquet, King Xerxes sends a message to his very, very pretty wife to come and be paraded in front of all the men. He wants to brag on her. And he's drunk. And she says, no. You don't do that to the most powerful man in the world, but she did. This official command to come, she goes, no. And it sent the king and all his officials into meltdown, like talk about anxiety, because they've realised that this could be the start of the women's lib movement. And they want to shut this thing down because they are panicking and they're feeling very, very anxious. Like, you may not personally think that you struggle with anxiety, that you're not fearful, that you don't worry, and that may be true. That anxiety is not a problem for you. But watch what you do next when you don't get what you think you need that you don't really need. King Xerxes thought that he needed his wife to come and be shown off in front of all his mates, but that was just the drink, that was just his ego talking. He didn't really need her to do that, but he thought he did. And you may not sort of think that you need people to show appreciation to you. You may not think that you need people to acknowledge what you've been doing when you've been working hard, but we sometimes, when people don't do that, we start to drop little subtle things like, boy, I'm tired, I've done so much this week, and we're trying to get someone to acknowledge it. Like, you may not, or in fact you may want people to like you, and you believe that you need everyone to like you. But that's not really true, because you can actually thrive when people don't always like you. And so we carry sometimes expectations of what we think we need that we don't really need. And if you don't know what you do when you don't get what you think you need, ask someone close to you, because they know what you do. And sometimes anxiety is expressed very differently in each one of us, because it depends upon our personalities. It can depend upon our childhood experiences. It could even be the story you tell yourself about yourself, the lies that we believe. For some of you, you think that you must, if you're going to do something, you must get it right the first time, every time. That's a lie that will cause anxiety to build up in you. For some of you, you feel like you need to know what to do in any circumstance, but that's not true. None of us can do that, and that will build up anxiety. But externally, in our communities, like with the coronavirus now, when that builds up to the level that it is, anxiety goes throughout the whole of the community, because it's universal, it affects all of us in some way. Queen Vashti, she says no. And it didn't just affect the king, it affected all his leadership team. They are all in fear of what this meant, because they know that if their wife discovers that Queen Vashti said no to the king, their wives are going to start saying no to them. And this causes great fear in the men and the leadership of this nation. So what's their solution? Well, they pass a law. And that's what happens when loss of control, when fear grows, we go to legalism. And this is the law that the NIV Bible records as the law they passed. And this is the law. Every man should be the ruler of his own household. There are Christian men today, and I haven't got time to go there much, but I'll just make this comment. There are Christian men today that believe that is God's plan for them. They wrongly believe that every man should be the ruler over his own household. And they don't understand that concept, that thought, that law, that rule came from the heart of a pagan king out of fear and anxiety trying to control the women in his life. Now we've got the girls in the background barracking for me. I can't control them, that's for sure. The truth is that poor old Queen Vashti, when she stood up and said no, they passed this law and she was vanquished. She was vanished. She was no longer able to ever appear before the king, and they decided that they would get themselves a new queen. Now that took a little while, and 4 years go by, and then some brilliant person in some little back room in the palace came up with this concept of a new TV series that they could start screening on TV back then. And so it was like a TV show. There was a little bit of like a cross between The Bachelor, The Farmer Wants a Wife, and Married at First Sight. And they called this new TV series The King Wants a Wife. Now, I know that that's not that creative, but this was the first time for them back then, right? It was basically a beauty competition, and the entrants had no choice about whether they participated. If you were picked, you played. And the talent scouts found this girl called Esther, and she was chosen and she was put into this beauty competition. Now, she was Jewish, and her background is that her parents or grandparents 100 years earlier had been taken into captivity into this nation. Her parents had actually died when she was little, and she was raised by her older cousin, Mordecai. Now, I want you to listen just for a moment to what the writers of this Old Testament book in the Bible, how they first introduce us to Esther. The NIV says that Esther was lovely in form and features. Another version says she had a beautiful figure and was extremely good looking. That's the sanitized version. The Hebrew really is saying she had a hot body and she was gorgeous. And it's all about her body shape. That's how they introduce us to Esther. Now, I don't know what qualified for a gorgeous figure 2,500 years ago, but I'm not sure that it's changed that much since then. And so she gets picked and she goes into 12 months beauty therapy and a special diet. And there's been many girls have been selected for this TV show. And the way it works is that after 12 months, they take one girl at a time, they take her to the king, she spends the night there, and in the morning she goes back to the harem, and whoever he likes the best wins the competition. Well, Esther wins. And in December 479 BC, Esther becomes queen of this vast nation. Now, her cousin Mordecai had instructed her, don't tell them you're Jewish. And he had, all her life, he's protected her, he's guided her, he's instructed her. And he can't see her every day in the palace, but he hangs around like the mum at the school gate. And he's passing messages in and out, and he's watching every day and barracking for her and helping her, guiding her. And while he's hanging around the palace one day, he hears a conversation, overhears it, and it's between two palace guards. And they are planning to kill the king, assassinate him. And so when Mordecai overhears this, he gets word to Esther to warn the king. And the king investigates this. And I don't know how they investigated back then, but the result was that the king very nicely hung these two blokes from a gallows and had them killed. And also had this recorded in the records of his kingship, this moment in his life. Now just jump forward another 4 years with me, and we get introduced to the bad guy in the story. His name's Haman. And if you can imagine a guy in a flashy suit, dark sunglasses, lots of jewellery, huge ego. In fact, wherever he goes, he wants people to bow down to him and worship him. He doesn't even want to be called just Haman. He wants to be called, hey man, like this. He thinks he's so cool. I just got a groan in the background from someone there. Sorry, Lauren. I'm trying to get your dad's sort of thoughts going through the place. He would have said that, right? So anyway, this evil man, Haman, goes to the king. He's now second in charge of the whole of the country. But he goes to the king and he starts lying about the Jewish people because Mordecai wouldn't bow because he was a Jew. And so Haman thinks, I'm going to kill Mordecai, but that's not enough. I'm going to wipe out the whole of the Jewish people in our community. Genocide. And when he goes to the king, he actually offers the king a huge amount of money for the privilege of doing this. He says to the king, "Oh, wonderful king, these people are sort of not fitting into our community. They're an ethnic group. We need to get rid of them. And if you'll let me have the privilege of doing that for your sake, I'll give you this huge amount of money." And Haman was superstitious, so he doesn't want to just have this happen on a particular day. He throws some dice in the air and he works out that there's a date in 11 months' time, and they're going to put a day aside it's called Kill a Jew Day. And the great thing about this plan is that whoever kills a Jew gets to keep their mobile phone, their car, their house, their bank accounts, everything they own. If you can kill a Jew on this day, you keep everything they own. Mordecai finds out about it. The email's gone everywhere and it hits him, and anxiety overwhelms him. When the fires hit this year, they took out much property, destroyed houses and livestock, and people lost their lives, and anxiety gripped our community. When COVID numbers start going through the roof, like in Melbourne, 500 people positive in the last 48 hours, that sends anxiety through our community because some of those 500 will die. It affects economically our whole nation, the world. And suddenly the Jews in this nation are faced with annihilation, and it's out of their control. And there's wailing and weeping and anxiety and crying throughout the whole of this known world. We catch other people's anxiety, and social media spreads it like a virus because we catch anxiety from each other. The most anxious person in the room has the most power. Whether that's in a family, in a team setting, in a workplace, the most anxious person has the most power because that person's anxiety, we try to resolve it. We try to fix it. We try to, and we lay down our own goals and plans to try and relieve their fears, and we end up doing exactly what they want. And the only way that can change, the normal path that goes, is for someone to lead in that situation with a non-anxious presence. Because anxiety is a negative spiritual force. Now, the only way that we can come against a spiritual force is come with a different spirit. And that's what a non-anxious presence brings into the room. And Mordecai had always played that role in Esther's life. He was the one guiding and directing, but now he's overwhelmed by what's happening. And you watch as the roles start to change. And Mordecai goes to Esther for help. And at first Esther's hesitant because they've got this rule that if the king doesn't invite you in, you can't meet with him. And if you walk in there and he didn't invite you and he doesn't want you there, you're put to death. And she hasn't seen the king for 30 days. He's got a harem to look after. He's got a lot of busy things to do, this king. And so Esther knows it's a risk, but she's willing to take it. And I want you to listen to the words of the writer of Esther at the end of chapter 4. This is what the writer says of the story. He says, "So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions." She's become the non-anxious presence in the room. And there's a plan for 3 days fasting for all the Jews. That's a sort of a reference, a subtle reference to God's involvement in this. That's about as close as we get in the story. And she has a plan that she's going to put a banquet on, and she's going to invite the king and this bad guy, Haman, just the two of them, to the banquet, and she's going to talk to the king about the problem. On the first banquet, because there's two of them, she's not quite game to say anything. And the king knows something's going on. And he asks her and says, well, I'll give you half of my kingdom. What do you want? And she says, well, actually, how about we come back tomorrow night? And I'm going to put another banquet on for you. And it might be better this time even. And then I'll tell you. And Haman, he's got this big ego. And he's loving being part of this little inner group. And he feels so special. And he walks out that first banquet, that first night, and as he walks out, Mordecai's there. Mordecai, he just causes so much grief to Haman, and Mordecai won't bow again. So Haman goes home that night. He's bragging on being part of this little inner group that he's been invited to, that he's coming back the next night, but he's cranky at Mordecai. So his family come up with an idea. They say to him, Haman, why don't you build a gallows on the front lawn of our house here and hang the bloke tomorrow? And Haman thinks that's a great idea. So the neighbours got no sleep that night. There's this construction crew. All the tradies are building this huge big gallows. And Haman is preparing to hang Mordecai the next day. That night, back in the palace, the king can't sleep. Some of you know that you're anxious. You know that it's hard to make decisions because what if you get it wrong? But some of you, when times are uncertain, you actually make more decisions. You do more action, you do more activity because you're trying to take control in uncertain times. You would probably even deny that you are anxious, but you just can't sleep. And what we try to ignore, our bodies can't. And anxiety comes out in a stiff neck and shoulders. We just feel tight internally. Our stomach's not settled. There's an anxiousness inside. That's like our heart's racing a little bit and there's no caffeine in the system. We can't shut down. We can't rest. Our mind keeps racing and we can't sleep. I love how David, when he was writing Psalm 139, he expressed some words, and I think he actually got it right. He said, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts." There's a place where we need to know what's really going on inside of us. Some of us are more aware of the effect of anxiety than others. And this king, he cannot sleep. And he gets up and he starts scrolling back through his Facebook page. And he gets to this place where it's recorded how Mordecai saved him from an assassination attempt. And so he asks those that are around him that night, he says, well, what was done for Mordecai? And they go, well, nothing. And the king goes, well, we've got to do something. And by the time the king had made this decision that they must do something to honour Mordecai, Haman arrives at the palace to ask the king to hang this same Mordecai. The king doesn't know that. And when he sees Haman walk in, he goes, Haman, I've got a plan. I want to honour someone. I want to really recognise this man for what he's done for our nation, what a great person he is. And, well, Haman's ego thinks it's got to be him. So he comes up with this American-style ticker-tape parade and to honour what he thinks is himself. And as he comes up with this plan, the king goes, that's great, Haman. I want you to do that for the Jew Mordecai. That's the moment when Haman knows he's in trouble. He doesn't understand what's going on fully, but anxiety now starts to really grip his heart. And as he has to fulfill this idea of what they planned for Mordecai, he goes through with it. But that night, when he gets home, he is destroyed. Emotionally, he's wrung out. He starts telling his family what he's had to do for Mordecai. And they say, Haman, you've got to remember he's a Jew. You shouldn't touch Jews. you're in trouble. And as Haman's trying to deal with how big a trouble he's in, the limousine arrives to take him to the banquet that night, the next banquet, right? The second banquet. He arrives at the banquet. They're just sitting down, the entrees start, and the king's impatient, and he says to Esther, Esther, tell me, what do you want? I'll give you half my kingdom. Well, she says this to the king. She gets really honest, and she says, my people have been sold to be killed and annihilated and slaughtered. And the king goes, what? What? Who would do this? Who would want to kill my queen? Who would want to kill her people? And this was the moment. And she goes like this. That evil man, Haman, is trying to do that. And the king was just outraged. And while he was stomping and carrying on and yelling and screaming at Haman, some little guy in a corner puts his hand up and says, excuse me, king, but I don't actually like Haman much. And I happen to know that he's built this gallows on his front lawn to hang Mordecai, the hero. Why don't you, king, hang him on his own gallows? And the king goes, brilliant, brilliant. So they hung Haman on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. And all of Haman's wealth was given to Esther, and she passed it on to Mordecai. Mordecai was put second in charge of the nation, a Jew. A queen is a Jew, and now second in charge is a Jew. The last part to the story that I don't want you to miss is this, that woven into the nation's cultural fabric, there was a non-negotiable rule. And it was that once a law had been passed, you could never revoke it. You could never roll back a law that the government had passed. So Kill a Jew Day was still going to go ahead. They couldn't stop this Kill a Jew Day. And we can't roll back coronavirus. We can't go back to pre-COVID days. It's here right now. And there are circumstances in your life that you don't have the power to roll them back, to change them. Any more than Esther did to change this Kill a Jew Day from going ahead. But Esther did something that you and I can do. She went to the king and asked the king to intervene and to protect her and her people. And on the 25th of June, 474 BC, a new, more powerful law was passed. A new covenant was established, and not one Jew died, because Esther asked the king to intervene. My brother Ken was in South Africa with some other pastors from his church when COVID-19 hit Australia, hit the world. And when they found out what was going on, they scrambled onto some planes to get back to Australia before the borders were shut. It took them 36 hours of connected flights to get back to Melbourne. And when they arrived at the airport, they travelled together back in the car to their homes. They shook hands, said goodbye to each other. And 2-3 days later, 3 of the 5 pastors that went to South Africa had COVID-19. The senior pastor nearly died. He ended up in intensive care, but the pastoral care pastor of Ken's church, a guy really loved by everybody, at 45 years of age, he's in intensive care, but his health is deteriorating rapidly. And we're aware of this, and I'll never forget the day when I got a text message from Ken to say that he had deteriorated so much that his wife had been called to say goodbye to him because he was about to die. But there was a call to pray. And I don't know what everyone else prayed that day. But I can remember standing with Coral and I, praying that God would heal him, save his life. And I can also remember praying that God would give the doctors a new strategy, something different to do that they hadn't already done. A couple of hours later, we got a text came back, and it said that they had rolled him over onto his stomach. He's lying face down, and he'd been needing 100% oxygen. And by doing that, he now only needed 70% oxygen. And then it became 60% oxygen. And over the next days, he was in an induced coma for a long time. But eventually, his life was saved. And I believe his life was saved through the power of prayer in that church, and for those that gathered and prayed together, that God intervened in his life. But what happens when God doesn't intervene how we want him to? How do we become a non-anxious person in an anxious world, in an anxious family? Well, we're going to have a look at that next week in part 2. So looking forward to next week. That will become a real and practical answer, I believe, next week. So we'll catch you then, and back to you, girls.